All right. So for today, and this was my attempt, Bill, of somewhat of the same thing, is to show basically an introduction to flow by starting to build some of the core components. And so this was an older visualization put together to actually try to identify all the different types of areas of flow. And basically there's three different areas. There's the data visualization side, there is the narrative side or the story elements that you're adding on top. And then there's the actual experience of how do you share it, how do you have a host a meeting with it, and all these different interaction mediums. And that within those, there are a lot of different details, and that we'll go through these, right? The swarms, the connections, all the different types of objects that you can put into these flows that end up making it up. And this in and of itself is a hierarchy, and we'll go through how we're going to build those. This is a radial hierarchy, which anyways, we'll get into it at some point here together, and is a kind of a powerful component of what you can do in 3 dimensions. But in terms of facilitating this, one thing that we are going to reference quite often is our demo media folder. And so let me make sure to get that up here. So I'm going to share this into the chat window. This will also be on the recording as well. So here in the chat window is a link to our just our Google Drive, and this is a demo media and assets folder. This is actually a great document to save, to reference. It has other information in it, including dot textures and other things that haven't quite made it into the editor yet, but are good reference materials as you start to build flows. And we'll keep adding more to this, including different backgrounds you can start to put in and things like that. So we'll be in the training data sets area. And specifically, we're going to look at the presidential interruptions. And I have this Google Sheet open already. And we will go through this flow. So let me first just go walk you through the flow and talk you why we start with this one to start learning. And this will check us off on a few different boxes here of our total game. So let's go back into 2020 and look at the presidential election and specifically the debates. And during these debates, someone took the time to actually timestamp out all of the times one person interrupted the other and how long that interruption took. So kind of a fun data set, nothing too serious. But what I like about it is that you can extend this application to most time series data, time and frequency. It's when did it occur and how often did it occur? And then within each of those occurrences, how long did it last? So what you're obtaining is sort of this multidimensional information. And what's powerful about flow is not just the 3D-ness, right? We sort of focus there, and you can see that in the AR videos and all these elements. But how do you tell a dynamic story, one that grows over time and helps you understand this information to a deeper degree? And I think this is one of the easiest ones to understand in terms of how you build a dynamic flow that starts to grow. So the first thing we do is just count. What are the total number of interruptions that happened during the time? And so there was 19 interruptions for Joe Biden, and Trump interrupted 47 times. And that's then when we look over time, when did they occur? So at what point during the day or during the actual debate did they occur? And you can see it's relatively spaced out. And then we can add in another dimension, which is the duration. How long did each interruption have, or how long was each interruption? And here we can see quite a large difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And then lastly, to actually stack those on top of each other to add them up and to look at the total amount of time that was taken. And so, this series of steps I think is highly repeatable in terms of showing frequency, duration, and then total sum. And so that mechanism is something to learn. But what this introduces you to is the idea of steps, the idea of filters, the idea of all these different storytelling components that will help you understand how to use the flow editor better. So I would encourage you to either follow along with me here to build along with me in tandem, or afterwards, what I'm going to ask is that as sort of a homework for next week, you either take this data set and rebuild something like this, or a data set that is similar in nature that includes time series and frequency events. And I can point you guys to other types of data that use that, including actually our baby data, where we kept track of our baby's first 7 weeks of life. In some sense, it's quite similar, where it's events, how long each of those events took, and what day or what day of the 7-week cycle it occurred at. So before I jump into the actual building of this, let me first pause and just see if there's any general questions or other housekeeping before we start to dive in.
It's Martin. Just a question. What do you recommend, that we watch and then do it, or we try to do it at the same time?
If you have 2 screens, I'd do it at the same time. If you're just
Okay.
single screening it, probably just follow along. And yeah, so that'd be my recommendation. But sort of depending on your level of I don't know what the overall comfort is. So anyways, we'll start to dive in. And
sorry, boss, on the Google Drive, there's two. There's a CSV file and I guess it's XLS file. Is there any difference between those 2 sheets?
Great question. So they are the exact same. So one is a CSV file and the other is a Google Sheet. And our system allows for both. Actually, let's actually just start to dive in, because this is a great way to start. So the data itself here, what you'll see is that there's a column called Interruptions. This was actually part of a larger data set where everything was tracked, not just the interruptions. And then what we have here is the start time and the end time in seconds, the total time, which is the difference between the start and the end time, so the amount of time in terms of seconds, who it was, the total time, which is a running sum of each person. So this is Joe Biden, and this is the total sum of that time. And then this is the minute at which the interruption occurs. You also notice that there's a hexadecimal value here. Now, if you're not familiar with these hex codes, these are actually color codes. Anything with a little hashtag in front, +6 hexadecimal characters, is a color code. And so one thing you can do inside of data sets is actually be very specific with your colors. So if you have, in this case, for Republican versus Democrat, there are sort of more clear color choices, and you can define those inside of the editor, but you can also define those within the data set. And so in this instance, we are defining it inside of the data set to be quite explicit about what color we want each dot to be. And so that gives you sort of infinite flexibility in terms of defining different color schemes, things like that. Cool. So let me pause there. Any questions on the data sets or what we're showing here?
My understanding is you can have 1 point per row.
Yes, that's right. And what's kind of cool about this one, and we might do it if we have a little time here, is this is actually a really good one for point per value, or point per value as well. We are typically point per row. Every row of a data set is a single dot, which is the case for this, where each dot is a single interruption, the duration of which is shown here. However, we could actually change this such that each minute is a dot. And so for that first one, it's actually 6 dots, not 1 dot. And so we can explore that. I think that's kind of an interesting way to start to use flow as well. We'll start to dive into. But yeah, great clarification. Any other questions? Okay, cool. So let's sort of start from scratch. So here in the flow editor, when you're on the home page, you click on, click on create new. And so in create new, you'll create a new flow. And this is where you will load your own data sets. Now, if you're having any troubles loading your own data set, it could be access, or if there's a few people that had not activated their accounts yet. So if you're running into any of those things, do let us know and we'll help get you by. So when you enter the flow editor, over here on the right is basically all of the details of what you'll be editing in terms of the object you have selected. And down here is the object timeline. I'm going to keep it on simple UI. So when you first start, you'll be in the simple UI. As you get more comfortable, you might switch and use the advanced mode, which is under this advanced UI. And so right away, the first storm is selected, and we're going to link it up to some data. Now, we do have 2 data sources that are easy to play with and practice with, or you can load in your own data set. So this is where you load in a CSV file, where you choose the file here, and we could choose that same file that is in that drive folder, or we can actually use Google Spreadsheet, which is what we'll use in this case. And so I will go back over to this documents, copy the URL, and paste that URL into this document. And it will pull in the first sheet. So it won't pull in the other sheets, but just the first sheets of this document into the flow. And if I click on edit, re-upload, I will be able to view that data. And there's actually other things you can do in terms of aggregation and grouping that we'll get into at a future date. But for now, this is just going to be single line data. So we have our data, and as Jimmy, you pointed out, each dot here is a row of that data set. So let's actually start to create and orient this. So first thing I'll do is I'm going to actually create a new step, which is the same as adding a keyframe in an animation or a slide into a deck, but it's the next frame of our story. And so I'm starting with this random view, but now actually starting to organize this. So the first thing we looked at was the overall count. And so to get to count, we're going to use categorized columns, and we're going to categorize it based on who. So it's either Joe Biden or it was Donald Trump. And so that we will see these based on that. And give me just one moment. So I'm going to save and refresh. So what you'll notice here is that after I made these changes, nothing looks like it updated here. And that could be for a variety of reasons, but so yeah, you'll see attempted transition to a non-existent perspective 1. So this is where you'll see error messages, and then we sort of see this all together. Is what we can do is if I go into the advanced UI, this will allow me to actually see the different perspectives. And it looks like there's a perspective 1 that was created, but it didn't have any values in it. And that's why it was throwing things off for us. And so here, what I'll do is change this to categorize columns. I want to categorize this based on who, in terms of either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And so this is that first view. So first thing we'll do is start to change that color. And we know that the color was something we referenced inside of the data set itself. So we can use this last one, which is called by hex values in column. Now, just to quickly elaborate on the different color options, you have fixed, where one color is for the whole swarm. And when you think of swarm, think of collection of dots. The dots exist somewhere, and you're moving those dots around, putting them in places based on their attributes. That is what a swarm is, basically. And so the other things you can do, gradient scale. So here we'll gradiate let's say how many minutes it took. So a short amount of time here in green, a long time is purple. Maybe not the best use here, but the last one, color scheme. This allows you to define a color scheme. In this case, we can have one based on the column who, which is Joe Biden or Trump. And then the color scheme itself, you don't actually see colors here, but these are actually all different combinations of colors that you can select from. And to define further categories of color schemes, you go into the Environment tab, and from here, you can create a custom color scheme. And so this is actually quite helpful, especially when it comes to custom projects, to be able to create a color scheme that is for that customer and apply it to multiple swarms, or to have it sort of across different steps. And so as I just built this one, if I go in and change this scheme, I will now see this new one I created called ASD, which is that color scheme in the Environment tab. And yeah, so that's how we set the colors. So I'm going to change it to by hex values and column, because we have it defined in this color column. So by selecting color, it is now referencing that cell in the data set, which is the hexadecimal value for color. So now we have it hard coded in for the count. Now, one thing you'll notice in the other one is that there was actually a number on top. Now, we don't have the ability to add in a label that counts it for you automatically. We do have the ability to add in labels, which allow you to add more annotations here. But yeah, for this case, we won't be able to put the total count on top. In a future lesson, we might be able to go through an instance where we show you how you could do that, where you add in aggregation and actually show that count as part of a hierarchy. But for now, what the easiest thing to do is to just add text to label it itself. And so 5 across, so 5, 10, 15, so 19 interruptions for Biden. I'm just going to type 19 and actually start to place this in the location. And you'll notice that these little arrows come up whenever you have an object selected, and this allows you to very easily move the object in the space. And one thing I would very much encourage is anytime you move something, there's often the temptation to think it's in the right spot. So like this, where it looks like it's in the right spot, when I turn to the side, I see that it's actually a little off. So here's a better example where it looks like it's right, but then when you actually move, it's not. And so rotating around the scene by clicking and dragging is really a good way to make sure you're in the right spot. I'm going to change the size of this from 5 to 3 to match this a little more clearly. I'm going to leave Trump blank for now, just to sort of skip through to move on. And the next step was to take this distribution of dots, which is
Michael.
Columns. Yes.
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt, but before you get off the issue with the total as a label, could you define a second sheet in the Google spreadsheet as a second data source and put subtotals or other data related to the first set of data, but sort of a different table, and access the two different data sources in this same construction environment?
So you can create a second Google, let me make sure to phrase this the correct way. In the process, creating a new sheet here and putting whatever information you have, it will be treated as a separate data set that is not connected to the first one.
Right.
So it won't be connected to this, but you can import as many data sets as you'd like. And essentially what you're doing is creating another swarm. So here I have another swarm, which is another collection of dots that is tied to a data set. So there's a one-to-one relationship between the data set and a swarm, but you can have as many swarms as you like. So you can have other data sets that are referenced to, so other sheets that you'd select from to pull in. Now, yeah, so does that answer I think that answers your question directly.
Yes, that's great, thank you.
Yeah, sure. And then the other way to answer this is that that within this sheet itself, there are things we could do to actually create some aggregations. So here, what we see is the total time sum increasing over time here. But what we would really like to do is it's just aggregating this minute column over time. And so that is something we could actually do by aggregating, and we could probably aggregate based on who. And so with this aggregation, where I created a snapshot, and we'll cover this in more detail because I don't really want to dive in too deep here. But this is where we would essentially add up the minutes. So we will aggregate. So we will sum up the total number of minutes for each candidate. So we have 701 minutes here for Biden and 2,116 for Donald Trump. And you can also see the total count. So this is how we got to the count. I could actually take this dummy variable and make this the count. And so now we have the count of the number of interruptions and the total number of minutes. And this was created without doing or touching anything else, but rather is creating a snapshot of the data. And we'll go through the snapshots at a future date, but essentially this second swarm could be that same data set, but it's now a snapshot. So we're referencing the snapshot data as opposed to the raw data. And so from this, we can start to do, we'll do more things to show that information. So I'm going to delete this for now, but that's where we can go. Yes.
Easy question, because is there any way to autosave stuff, because it just killed my progress? So for future.
Yes.
Yeah.
So by default, it auto saves, I think, every 30 seconds. And that is set within settings. Within settings, there is autosave checkbox, which is by default checked. You can uncheck that if you don't want to use that, and then just Control S or going in to click save will suffice. There is version control now, which allows you to go through different versions similar to like Google Sheets, where you can reference previous steps to go back to and to restore from. And so there are a lot more options there. And one thing I would very much encourage is that if you have a flow you're working on, you get to a step where you want to do something more experimental or go off in a new way that you're not sure about. One thing you do is the Save As button will save a new version of this that you can save a new file type name. And so sometimes you can do that, but sort of up to you in terms of how people want to create versions with version control or new flows entirely. But you save that flow name here. Say interruptions. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So moving forward here, what we'll do next is actually take this categorized column and start to lay it out along a scatter plot. So on the x-axis, what we're going to do is put the different times. So I believe it's source time, end time, total time. So I believe if we put start time on the width axis, what we'll start to see here is the distribution of when these interruptions occurred. And actually, instead of that, maybe I can do just minutes. Yeah. So a minute is when these occurred. And so, so each dot here is when it happened along the event itself. I'm going to hide this 19. I can click on it and click on this eye icon to hide it. The other thing I can do is click the eye icon here to show or hide visibility, or double click on it for on the object timeline to hide it. So many options to hide it. On the swarm itself, the one thing to add in is who. So now we see Biden on one side and Trump on the other. And I'll go ahead and make this just a little more narrow. Sorry, not that one, but the depth axis, I'll make 0.2 meters. And this is all in meters. So it's 1 meter wide by 0.2 meters in depth. So now we have this labeled so we can see when these interruptions occurred. And let me go ahead and add in another step where we're adding in that additional dimension. And I think this is actually one of the core sort of design principles that we see often used, is to build things that incrementally add in dimensions. That's here on this height axis, I want to put in the total amount of, not minutes, total time that was spent interrupting. In this case, it's in seconds. I'm going to make this go a little higher. So it's going from 0 to 100. And what you'll notice is these dots are raised up, but what we want is actually a line to connect them, since we're basically using this as more of a bar graph in some sense, where we are raising each one. And so to add in that bar elements, we create something called connections. And so in this instance, I want to connect the dot back down to the axis. So I click on connect dots to axis or map. And you'll notice these other options, which we'll get to as well. In row order does exactly what you imagine. In the exact order that the dots show up, it will connect the dots. And so here you're noticing how it connects between Biden and Trump back and forth, because it doesn't know what order to go in. It just goes in the order that it's showing up. The other is when column values match. So in this case, I could, if this were more of a bar graph or more of a line graph, I can select 2 as the thing to match. And so now we see this line chart over time, which is also sort of not accurate of what we're trying to show here, but just gives you a sense for what is happening there. By row number and column is a little more detailed and has more to do with connecting based on a identifier in a column, little more specific use case, and same with ID in column, which is for edge connections. But to axis or map is the main one we're going to use here and is used quite often. You'll notice that it's dropping along the height axis, and that you do have other options here. You can do the inverted, where it's going from the top to the bottom as opposed to the bottom axis. You can also drop along the different dimensions here for width or depth. So if you'd like, you can actually create a 3-dimensional view just with these lines in a scatter plot. But we're going to leave these as more of this bar view for now. I'm going to make them just a little thicker, maybe as 9 in terms of thickness. And yeah, so now we see these bars. So now we can see the total duration in each of those interruptions. One other thing I'll do here is set camera, which it allows you to set the camera position for each step. So each step has a camera position, a series of object definitions, and you're basically moving between these steps. And that on each of these moves, the camera is moving and there's a certain animation duration. Now that animation duration between is actually defined within step details. So this contains all of the different steps and the amount of time between steps, as well as some other attributes here, such as actions, which allows you to do some more on a per step basis. So just to cap this off as sort of a final step, let's actually add these together and show them as a stacked bar chart. And so for this, what I'll do is create a new step. And now instead of on the width axis being minutes, I just want the total time, not total time.
Michael, can you move your video over just a little bit? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is total time sum, which if I put the width axis back on, what you'll see is basically it's the running sum over time of the amount of interruption. And this was calculated in the document itself so that we could show it. But in that snapshot that we created, that's essentially what we were doing is creating a sum aggregate view as well. And so what this will look like if I collapse this axis is it should look like just a single bar. And this is the total amount of time that was spent between the two. So we've now sort of covered sort of all the span of what was in the original documents. There's obviously a lot of formatting here that has also been added in terms of labels, legends, and some other things there, which we will get into as we get more into formatting and delivery of content. But just in terms of understanding the content here, hopefully this helps you understand this idea of steps. You're building steps to build a presentation, and that within each step, you're defining the characteristics that relate back to the data set itself. And just for fun here, I'm going to do one last thing, which is I'm going to go back to this step in particular. And I'm going to duplicate this swarm. So duplicating this swarm will create another swarm that's the exact same characteristics. But just because we brought it up earlier, I think I want to do point per value. So now each dot is not a row, but instead a value. And that's going to be based on the total time is actually the what we want to look at. So each I guess each second now is going to be a value. So maybe there's a few too many that will show up. But what this should look like is, let me go ahead and turn off the height axis. And it should look the same. And the one thing I'll do instead here is in additional dimensions, I'm going to add in what are called columns, or actually not columns, I'm going to do stacks. And so this is just stacking the dots on top of one another. And so the reason I show this right next to this one maybe is that these basically are showing the same thing, just two different ways. And you'll notice that sort of throughout the flow editor is that there's always multiple ways to do things, and each has its pros and cons.
So Michael, maybe make the dots a little bit bigger or get in a little closer so you can really see that one is a dot with a line and the other is a bunch of dots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you guys see that okay?
Difference there?
Yep. And so yeah, this is basically the same thing. One is point per row with a connection, and then this is point per value with the dots stacking. And both are equivalents. The one nice thing about this, these stacks is that you can do more combinations just by changing, something like the depth axis. So if I remove who, now what will happen is actually the blue and the red will stack on top of each other when they're on at the same time. They're not at the same time because they couldn't interrupt each other exact same moments. So that doesn't quite work there. But anyways, just shows you how many different options are available. And that's even within each of these steps, we'll define other characteristics such as interactions. And this is used way more in objects to bring in more interaction, especially for live meetings, where you're actually selecting the columns of what you'd like to show up when you click on a dot. It looks like something might have happened here with the flow itself, which we'll figure out. But this is essentially this interaction capability.
Just one question on that. You introduced a new swarm in order to produce the second visualization. Would it not have been possible to do that with the same data and just reproduce the minute axis and do it in a different format, like make a whole new chart, with the same data set and reproduce a different setting of the visualization?
I'm not sure I'm fully following, but let me try to repeat back because I think what I'm sorry.
Why did we end up setting up why did we need a new swarm to create the second visualization instead of just making a new visualization with those properties?
Got it. So so if I define it this way, so a flow is a series of steps. So in this case, there's 5 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in each step, we can have as many swarms or collection of dots as we like. In this case, we have 2 swarms. And the reason we did 2 swarms is that each swarm definition can only be point per row or point per value. You can't switch it between steps. It's sort of a characteristic of the swarm itself.
Okay.
So that's part of it. And the other aspect here, I'm sorry, give me one sec, is that sorry, sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought, but yeah, that basically each swarm is actually referencing the same data set. So there's only one data set still, and we can check that by clicking on the hamburger and clicking on data source, and we'll notice there's just one data source here. And that one data source is feeding multiple swarms so that we could have many swarms in the same scene or same step that references. So so hopefully that answers your question in terms of structure. So I think of swarm as like a chart, I guess, in some sense. Each swarm is its own chart with all the connections and labels attached to it, and that each step can have as many swarms as you like.
I'd like to add something to that, Michael. Go back to the swarm view. So one of the things in order to build a system like this is this concept of perspectives, and we hide the perspectives. They're automatically generated in simple mode, but in advanced mode, there's these perspectives, and you'll see that each time he changes a step, it will switch to a different perspective. Right now it's on perspective 4 and etc. So everything from that perspective area downward is affected by the perspective. It means that they can be changed per step. And the things above it, which are like a connection is the same. When you define a connection, it's the same across all of the steps. It's not affected by perspectives. The point per row is the same across, and actually the source and snapshot, you have to apply that to a swarm, and you can't change that per step. So does that make it a little bit more clear that I know it can be a little complicated. I've got this swarm, and it's got certain attributes on the swarm, and then I've got a bunch of other attributes on the perspective within the swarm and multiple perspectives. We try to hide that complexity, but if you at least understand that that's what's going on underneath the covers, then you'll be able to figure out what to change, how to change what aspects of the swarm where.
I starting to get my head around it, especially since it's all operating on the same data set. You're really just you're offering a different, it's each a different instance of sharding, even, you know, of the, it makes sense of it.
Yeah. So great. So yeah, so as homework for everyone, I would encourage everyone to try to find data set like this. If you like, you can just use this one in that sample media folder. You know, one that is actually not too far off from this is actually one that we built for my toddler's first 7 weeks of life, and showing the frequency of all of the diaper changes, basically, of her life, at least the first 7 days. And so this is, in many ways, a very similar structure that is used, where this is frequency, how often did they occur, and then the duration of each of these, and then stacking them on top of one another to show the total. And then actually in this one, because it was time-based, to be able to show the day of the week of when these occurred. And that simple data set, you know, reached so many. So this idea of building an incremental set where you're adding these dimensions is actually quite powerful. So I'd encourage you to, yeah, find your own data in this realm, and we are happy to help you find it or use this. But this way you all get practice with building steps and animating between those steps with a fairly simple flow type. So Bill, Jason, Alexei, anything you guys would like to add before we open it up and close it down?
Yeah, I just say, I think you probably already said it, Michael, but I just like to reiterate that there's no limit within each step or each scene, if you will, to the number of swarms, number of text objects, number of images, number of maps. All these, you can have unlimited numbers within a particular scene. You know, you reach practical limits eventually, but there's no theoretical limit. And it's been a long time since I've built a flow where I don't have many of these objects on at least one of the steps or several of the steps of the flow.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I think in many ways what we start with is something simple, but just to quickly show here over my shoulder, this was it's a live flow, which we can send you the link to, but it's a National Cancer Institute's project. And that file here on the bottom is actually a 8 GB image of cell data. And all of this is interactive, it's multi-user, and this was a huge undertaking, which we're happy to go through more with people to show all sort of the capabilities and what you can do here. But I think it's cool to see how one system can be used for this really intensive analysis and exploratory use case, in addition to what we just built, which is a very directed story, that we built in a few minutes here, that you can send and present to someone. And what we are hopeful with this group is that we sort of see a span of people, those that are interested in building out some larger engagement type things, but that these types of more directed visualizations, especially in more of this branding, sales and marketing use case, that have brands that are interested, and that we can line you up to help deliver on these more directed flows and start to make money doing so. So we're excited to keep building it out with you. And yeah, so any other questions before we close things off for today? Hopefully this was interesting to you, and we look forward to the next sessions here. We're going to cover the same thing tomorrow, so don't need to come tomorrow for people here today. But next week will be new material.
I have a request. So we're actually putting a new template user interface onto the front end of this. We've found that building up these flows from primitives is very powerful, but it also is a fairly difficult first-time user experience, early user experience. And so if anyone would like to spend an hour or more with me to help us review the designs on that and look at some of the first prototypes as they come off the assembly line, I'd really appreciate a little bit of user testing from anybody if they have a little bit of time that they'd like to work with me on. My email is, thanks, Mickey. My email is jason@flow.gl. So in addition to that, you can contact me about anything and everything that you would like to discuss.
Yes, I highly encourage everyone to pester Jason as much as possible. He is the key to getting your request into the editor. So, or us, just let us know. But no, in all seriousness, I think that getting you guys actually involved in templates might be something we do very shortly here. Because as we just start to define more of these templates, they can be both simple, but also quite complex to allow people to build off of. And one thing we imagine is that people might be able to build templates for organizations, and that is something that they could sell with color schemes and other things like that. So anyways, this was lesson 1, so hopefully not too scary and approachable. We'll send an email summary as well as we recorded this session, so we'll upload it so you can have something to reference. But would really encourage you to dig in, dive in. We're here. We have Discord. You email. We respond to pretty much everything besides smoke signals. So that's about it. Jason, Bill.
I just wanted to say one thing also. This is a large product. It's a great product. It's got a lot of moving parts, and there's no such thing as a silly question. So if as you get into this, you find, I know there's a way of doing this. It's just not obvious to me. Please send us an email. I spend all day, every day working with users, so I don't mind getting emails on whatever the topic is. So we'll look forward to hearing from you and helping you out as quickly as we can.
All right. Very good. All right, I think that's it. And sorry, I saw one question here. Jimmy, did you get your stuff all sorted out? Looks like we're good. Okay. Very good. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. I'll see you guys next week, and don't be a stranger. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.